So before we took break, I created a student class inside of my models.py file that is located within my attendance application. And then I ran a migrate Python manage.py make migrations, which created this initial 01 initial.py file. And then in order to insert it into my database, I needed to run Python manage.py migrate attendance. What questions do you all have about that process? All right. So now we can start interacting with our database. Now, historically, we normally just go into our school database and run like insert into, student, blah, 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 and like some other raw SQL commands. But going forward, we're going to actually start interacting with our database using Python. And there's a couple things I need to install before I do that. I don't necessarily need to, but it'll just make my life a little easier. I'm going to install some things to directly interact with my Postgres database. So I'm going to install Django extensions, which just extends the functionality of Django, gives it a little bit more functionality. I'm also going to install, so I'm first going to install that. And then I'm going to install something called IPython, which is like a Python shell that I can enter into and interact with our database. All right. So I installed Django extensions and IPython. You don't necessarily need to install these, but just the way I'm going to be interacting with my Postgres database, I'm going to install them. Now, in my settings.py file, I need to do one more thing and install or add my Django extensions. Is that how you spell it? Extensions app, because I just installed this, and it is in fact considered like an application. You don't need to do this every single time, but Django extensions is kind of nice to have if you want to interact with your database via the command line. So just like I was doing, entering into here and like select everything from attendance, students, like there's nothing in there yet. But now I'm going to interact with the Postgres database in a more Pythonic way. So I'm going to do Python manage.py shell plus, and then -- IPython. Oh, I spelled that wrong. So now I'm in an IPython, a shell where I can actually interact with my database by writing raw Python or just Python code.
What was that last command again, Tom?
Let me quit. So clear. It was Python manage.py. So I'm running that manage.py file, shell plus, followed by the IPython. I think you can just, if you didn't install IPython or Django extensions, you could probably just run manage.py shell plus, and it should still work. But because I installed Django extensions and IPython, I want to use the IPython shell. All right, so now when I'm here, it says in line 1, I can actually start writing Python. So I can say like new student equals the name of the student class, right? I'm going to do student, and I can actually do some keyword arguments. So like first name equals, say, Tom, last name equals Preet, And then I can say like email equals tom@tom.com. So I'm creating a new student object, and I'm inserting the first name to equal Tom, the last name to equal Preet, and the email to equal tom@tom.com. Now if I click enter, so nothing happened, it's usually a good sign. But if I now say new student, I have a student object right now. But now notice how it says none right now. So I just want to make sure I can say new student dot name, I'd say first name equals Tom. So now if I do new student again, I get that student object, but it's not saved to my database yet. In order to save this student object to my database, I can say new student dot save and invoke it. It should save it directly to my database. So like nothing happened, that's great. So it's just like running the insert into students, name, or first name, last name, email, values. So it's just like running the, insert into attendance, students. I just say like students, class, first name, last name, email, values, Tom, Preet, tom@tom.com. It's literally what I just did by creating a new student object and doing .save. I literally just did the same thing as this raw SQL.
And .save knows where to save it because of the settings file?
It knows like as far as for like what database to save it to?
Yeah.
Yes. Yep. And if I come over here into my database, if I open attendance students, if I refresh that, I get Tom Preet, blah, blah, blah.
What if you wanted to put in, say, an integer? Do you still have to put it in as a string like that? Where you go new student first name equals Tom?
So if I did like students, so if this was an integer field.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't need to put a string. So if it was an integer field, like if I had age, it would just be like student. Whoop. Come on. Whoops. Student like age equals like 18, like 78 or whatever. So you don't need to use a string. Was that the question?
That was the question. Thanks.
Cool. Yep. Cool. Let's add some more students. So Noah equals. So I can also just do student dot first name equals like Ruthie. Last name equals Cohen. Email equals like Ruthie at email.com, followed by .save. Nothing really happened, but if I look at my database and refresh it, I've got Ruthie Cohen in there now. Now, before, so this is how we this is how we can use Python to insert and create new students. But if we wanted to actually query a student using Django, we can say query in Django. So making queries in Django. So Django has all these different ways to search for or search through your Postgres database. So here's an example of models with the field name of blog, author, entry. So you can create objects. This is literally what we just did. We essentially created a new student by doing student, first name, last name, email, and doing .save. Where are we at? Now we can actually search for, so retrieving data entries. So if I wanted to retrieve all the students, if I'm looking at this one, I can say entry.objects.all and invoke it. But the entry is the name of the table. So I can do student.objects.all, and I get a query set back. And this query set looks like it's an array of student objects. Kind of like, remember creating apple trees and or storing like an array of apple objects or an array of tree objects. So I can say like all students equals student dot objects dot all, and I can print all students. And now it's a query set as an array of objects. So if I wanted to access the very first index at index 0, it should be this student object right here. So there's my student object. I can figure out the name of that student object by doing first name. It's Tom. If I wanted to figure out what the value of the second student, the first name of the second student, it's Ruthie. So again, student.objects.all gets all the elements or queries, or gets all the values in the student table. If I wanted to get the very first element, I can do student.objects.first, I believe, and invoke it, and it returns the very first student object. I can test it by testing the first name. So the first name is Tom. If I can get the last one is Ruthie, because there's only 2 values in the database. Now, if I wanted to get one by a specific field name or field value, so I can do, so I've got entry.objects.all. You can do filter is another one. That's how you can filter specific things. You can do objects.entries.get, where the primary key is 1. So I can say like Tom equals student.objects.get, where the primary key equals 1. And it looks in the database, says, hey, where's the primary key, which is the ID field? What's the value of this query at the ID of 1? So if I click that and I click Tom, the Tom.firstName equals Tom. I can do email as well. So I'm grabbing an individual element or individual value from the database. All right. If I quit this and clear that. So now let's say I want to make a change to my student table. So say I want to create another field called created at. Created at, and this is a models dot. What kind of field should we do this? Let's do a date time field. So class date time field right here, because I want to know what time this specific student was created or the specific value was created. So I can say, hey, date time field has two parameters, auto now false or an auto now add equals false. So I don't necessarily know what that means. So I'm going to say date time field Django auto add now. Say example. Because I'm a new developer, I don't necessarily know what this means. So I have this model, date time field true. So any field with an auto now attribute set will also inherit editable field false. There has been talk in the past about okay, blah, blah, blah. So to make this work, I'd recommend not using the auto now. No, I don't like that. Where's auto now add? So let's see what the difference is. Auto now updates the field of the current time and date every time the model is saved. Auto now add updates the value, the time and date of the creation of the record. So this is what I want. This auto now add, that's what this is. So initially the defaults are false, but if I want date time field, auto now add to equal true. So I made a modification to my table. So once I made a modification, I need to go through that process again of creating a new migration script that includes this created at. So right here it's 01 initial.py, but if I run the Python manage.py make migrations attendance, says I'm getting an error now, or like not an error, but like a thing. It says you are trying to add the field created at with an auto null add true to a student without a default value. The database needs something to populate existing rows. So I've already created values in my database, but now it needs to know, hey, what should the default value of these created at fields be for these two users? So I can say provide a one-off. So please enter the default value now as valid Python. You can accept the default value time zone now by pressing enter, or you can provide another value. I'm just going to use the default value. Cool. So it said migrations for attendance. It created this new record or this new file 002 student created at. So here's that second migration script. And it kind of names it kind of like what the change is. So student created at. So I actually added the created at field. So this is what that looks like. So I'm adding a field named a student created at and all this information. So now I can actually execute that script by Python manage.py migrate attendance. It says operations to perform all migrations attendance, applying that 002 student created at migration. Now, if I come over here and look at my database, if I refresh it, it's got that created at now. And if I go into IPython, and I do student.objects.all and grab the first element, dot created at, I get the date time zone of when it created at. Another, if you want to see specifically what SQL queries these student.objects.all are actually doing, there's a cool, so inside this Python manage.py shell plus dash IPython, if I do dash, I think it's print SQL. Let's see if this works. If I do student.objects.all, it'll tell me specifically the SQL query that it's performing. So running students.objects.all is running the SQL query. And then the output is this. If I do 0 dot first name, it's the same thing. It's running this students.id first name limit 1. Clear. What questions do you have about creating a database, creating an app, creating models?
So when we made changes, we didn't have to drop anything. We just created a new one and inserted it over.
Yep.
Okay. And then it asked us about the empty values, and we just manually inserted those values.
Yep. You can provide a default value to that. And I encourage you to look at the documentation, which you're going to have to, especially in the next 3 days. You can add additional things like default value or like default equals some value if you want. Just look at what fields take in a default value if required.
And if you did that default value, it wouldn't ping you like it did?
Correct.
Gotcha.
It might have, but I think it still would have. But like if you provide a default value, you might not need it's not necessarily required to provide a value for the created at date.
Is there a way to add data to the tables with like a C file, like we were doing with SQL?
Yeah, there is. We're not going to go through that today, and we're not really going to cover like inserting seed data, but essentially, but yeah, there is. You can create like a separate seed file and like run that seed file. Yeah. So pretty much like when you're doing this, I was doing the student.create or or like creating a new student object. You can essentially do that, but put that stuff into a separate file.
Tom, what did you type again to get to here?
It is Python manage.py that shell plus, and all this stuff is in the lecture notes today. So,
Okay.
Yep. All right. And again, to get out of your virtual environment, just after you're done with everything, if you ever want to get out of it, you just type in deactivate. So with that, I'm gonna